Alright, so by popular request, I'm going to make this lecture presentation video about Madeleine R. Hannah's 2019 article, actually. So this is pretty recently published. It was actually published in December. It's called A Changing Understanding of Writing. This article is great. This semester is the second semester I've taught it, and I guess I've been pretty much teaching it since it was published. To be honest, I can't even recall how I found it. I think it was, a suggested article that was like related to one I was reading at the time in preparation for the course I was soon to teach. It's kind of like, like a YouTube video recommendation, I guess. But in the world of academia instead. Before we jump into the article, just to refresh your memory, I want to read the abstract to get the general course and scope of the article back on stage, I guess. Alright, so here's the abstract. As student writers gain more instruction and experience, their beliefs about writing and their own writing practices change. Based on prior research about writing development and the author's own experiences, a developmental scale was created that can be used to chart the typical course of a writer's growth and understanding of writing. It is not strictly linear, and stages might be skipped, condensed, or combined. Like the writing process itself, the scale is recursive. Ideally, the writer would get into a cycle of repeating the final two stages, building on former knowledge and always seeking new understandings that can be applied to both learning and teaching writing. Yeah, so if you went to the slide recently, I've kind of edited it and added a lot of extra questions at the front for you to think about as you're reading it or rereading it and, studying it. I put all of these questions here not to front load your studying the article or overwhelm you with the possibilities of questions that you can ask about a piece of writing, this piece in particular, but to just give you an idea of, the kinds of things that you might want to think about. Not all of them, but, take what speaks to you most, and think about those things as you're studying the article and getting ready to either imitate or emulate some part of its form or fashioning in your own piece of writing. You were probably reading this as part of the sequence of readings that I've designed for this course to prepare you to write your literacy narrative. Kind of sidebarring and continuing that tangent. This article is really interesting because it combines the best of, well, maybe not the best of both worlds, but it combines two different essential components of two very different ways of writing, which are the personal essay and the academic essay, or the informal and the formal, or maybe the non-researched and the researched. But it's really cool because not only is it accessible and introduces a lot of sometimes fairly complicated scholarship into the discussion, it also uses research in a way to communicate with personal experience and make that personal experience. See, I think students often see writing as either going toward a research paper or going away from that, where they can write about themselves and use, personal pronouns. I can't tell you how many times I've had the question asked to me from freshman students, can I use I in my paper? Yes, of course you can use I. I mean, not only can you probably should. So for starters with these questions, ask yourself, that basic question, or maybe not basic, but essential question that your teachers always ask you to try and figure out when you're studying a piece of writing. What is Hannah's thesis in this essay? Does she have a thesis? You can ask that too. Can you identify her writing goals and her hopes of what she can offer her readers? just to give you a heads up, she does have a thesis. You can identify her writing goals, and she pretty clearly outlines her hopes of what this essay might accomplish. Continuing that line of questions, does Hannah have a clear understanding of her audiences and who are her audiences? Yeah, totally, she does. She knows exactly who she's writing to. She's writing teachers and students in writing courses or who have to, make their way through academic essay assignments. The status of the student and the status of the teacher, they're often not equated, but one given precedence over the other, or at least looked at as two different levels, with the status of the teacher being higher than the student. In this case, she's offering her writerly development scale as an opportunity to both of these audiences, for both of them to grow by locating themselves along its sequence and figuring out how to get into that latter cycle of recursion with the final two stages, as opposed to the former, where you're stuck and either don't know what's going on or can't really express that irksome feeling that you have. What effect or effects does reading her article have on you? Do you relate to it? Can you, can you vibe with what she's talking about and maybe see some of your own experiences in the way she's relating hers? What effect or effects do you think it might have on readers aside from yourself? Another question you could ask in place of that second one is, do you think a lot of people would be able to relate to this article, judging from your own experiences you've seen your friends, your peers, and just other people have, and maybe even extend from there and consider the kind of use value that something like this could have if not only you but a lot of other people can relate to it and benefit from it. That's a valuable piece of writing. All right, so here we go with the more specific lines of questions. In what ways does she incorporate outside research into her article? What is all this extra research doing there? There's a lot of in-text citations covering many different publications of composition scholars, many well-known names in the field of composition, and articles to match that have had profound and major influence. If you look in the references page, there's, on just a rough glance, maybe 15, 16 or so sources. That's a good amount of sources. Maybe it doesn't seem like a lot if you're not having to write this, but handling that many references in the space of a 5-page article is quite the challenge, and she takes it up well and accomplishes it. So, think about, how she's incorporating these resources and structuring them into her piece to set her self up for creating a more powerful effect on her audience, and also to serve as a when you use the word credible, it kind of comes with some strange connotations, but she's using these outside sources to set her own experience up in a more credible, or at least researched light, to reference her own experiences in light of scholarship is a clever way of not only understanding her experiences better, but creating a scale that's, or the writerly development scale that's quite relatable by a number of students and teachers alike. And what about the way it's structured? A structure, I think, is an accessible point of entry when trying to develop your writing process. With the structure, are there sections? Yeah, obviously, even if you didn't read it, you can look at it and just see that there are, bold headers scattered throughout the piece, which, of course, indicate different sections. Do the sections serve a purpose? Yeah, definitely they do. They delineate the steps and stages, or phases, as she sometimes calls it, of the writerly development scale. So if you're going back to this, you can locate where you need to read instead of having to skim through to get to the start of one of the points, or one of the stages. Are they useful? Do they provide a sense of organization? Do they make it more navigable? All kind of variations of the same question, but maybe you can answer each with a bit of nuance. All right, so getting into the first section, what do we know about writing? I'm just going to leave this on the screen and kind of trace our way to where this comes into play in the actual article. Essentially, she begins this article by tracing some specific window of her literacy development, right? So really, she opens it and introduces this in the form of a literacy narrative. Indeed, that's exactly what she's trying to find more out about, or find out more about. She says, near the end of my time as an undergraduate student, I was stunned to find out that although I had always loved to write and excelled in my English classes, I knew no strategies for addressing writing. I was taking a class on style and genre at the time, and I realized that even the most basic, common-sense understanding of the writing process had so far eluded me. She says, how could this be? You can almost feel like that was the original seed of thought. It seemed impossible that I had made it so far without acquiring any practical strategies for generating ideas, any appreciation for the importance of format and genre, any understanding of how writing can be taught. And yet, there I was, about to graduate college without being able to articulate how or why I wrote the way I did. It became clear that I was not the only one who had been left in the dark. Everyone in my class, it seemed, was having the same revelations. Outside of class, the situation was much the same. Friends I talked to, including English writing majors and future teachers, confessed feeling similarly confused and unprepared for the demands of the writing tasks before them. Basic strategies for drafting and revising were world-shaking epiphanies to them. You gotta, how the heck did... The more people I talked to, the more I realized I was not alone. So look at this sentence right here. The more people I talked to, the more I realized I was not alone. My first few reads through this article, I think I just kind of skipped past this sentence. But what's happening here is her informing us that she had conversations about this with a lot of folks. And she was compelled to talk more and more about this, to find out the stories of more and more people, to see where her own experiences stood in relation to a collection of others. And I guess in some ways that actually symbolizes what she's doing with incorporating so much scholarship. She's setting her own experiences in relation to this sequencing of academic scholarship concerning the field of composition from the mid-20th century onward. So the more people I talked to, the more I realized I was not alone. You can almost read that as the more sources I studied and the more scholars whose articles I read and tried to understand, the more I realized I was not alone. Or the more I realized I really didn't know as much as I thought I did. As a future educator, I was naturally drawn to the pedagogical implications of all this. Implications, indeed. It became apparent that many of my own teachers had unknowingly failed me because they themselves had never been given access to the knowledge and strategies I was learning. Well, there's a sentence that's going to create interest, right? To keep reading. I know at that point I was like, okay, tell me more. I got to know more about this. After all, you can't teach what you don't know. I was thrilled to be learning ways to improve my own writing habits, but I was even more interested in finding out how writing can and should be taught. As I contemplated my own development, I considered how I would go about leading others through the same steps of growth. My hope is that by exploring my own journey as an emerging writer, and here's her hope, that's one of the words in those first questions, I can offer some insight for student writers into their own developmental process. Further, I hope that teachers of writing can use my experience to better understand the experiences of their students. Ideally, teachers and writers alike will come away from this paper with a better understanding of the writing process, as well as practical applications that they can use to engage in and instruct writing. So yeah, what do we know about writing? Well, maybe not as much as we thought we did, right? So here is a very appropriate place to start introducing the history of composition scholarship to lead us to, a more fulfilled, complete present moment of understanding the scope of this subject that we somehow made our way through, but didn't really understand the underpinnings of. So yeah, of course it's appropriate to trace that course through referential scholarship, right? It's a good structuring method. All right, so what is writing? This is a deceptively easy question. Well, it seems easy, but it's actually quite difficult to answer. It's almost like a trick question to say, what is writing? Well, it's a million things, and it's a million and one more things, Aside from all the various personal and generalizable particularities of what writing is and what it does and how it's changed over time, all of that goes back to writing as a thing that happens through time. It's a process. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Sometimes, these things go out of order, they overlap, they skip and blend and combine and communicate in unexpected, sometimes crazy, wild, but, hopefully interesting ways. So writing is a process. It's a recursive and generative process. When something recurs, it means it repeats. And through repetition, it can become established. Maybe think about the word generative before recursive. You're generating content or generating the end result of channeling something through language that exists from one place but now on the page or on the digital document. And then once that's there, you can do stuff with it. You can shape it and mold it and use it for different purposes and be creative, etc., etc. And in that way, the generation of content and the ability to handle it outside of a linear flow of time, those two work together. And that, I think, in essence, is the process. In a nutshell, in a very general nutshell, that's what's happening with writing. But a more researched, informed definition goes something like this. A functional approach to language, this is writing again, is a functional approach to language which places an emphasis on construction of meaning rather than a set of prescriptive rules. So that's her quoting, or actually I think paraphrasing, Halliday, where she says, Halliday described a functional approach to language which places an emphasis on construction of meaning rather than a set of prescriptive rules. As cited in Bloor and Bloor. So she's, Okay, let's take a moment to look at this for a second. As cited in Bloor and Bloor, 2013. This is cool because you can see from this, she's reading an article by Bloor and Bloor, which references an article by Halliday. And instead of just skipping over that and saying, all right, cool, whatever, they made a reference, she's doing some digging. She's putting on her Indiana Jones hat and going out for a treasure hunt. All right. Writing is a functional approach to language which places an emphasis on construction of meaning rather than a set of prescriptive rules. So what does this mean? Why am I, driving this over and over, making this recur, right, through the presentation? It's important because it brings attention to something a lot of students have become distracted from. To understand that writing is an emphasis on construction of meaning instead of just meeting the parameters which exist at the surface level of an assignment, such as, make sure you don't have any run-on sentences or using all your commas correctly. Those are important things, but they are not the main focus of producing good content. They help hold the thing in place and maybe shape some of its flow along the way. Or they definitely, grammar and mechanics definitely help shape the flow of a piece of writing. But the grammar is not the writing. The mechanics is not the writing. The meaning that's been constructed through language is the writing. So writing is and should be an emphasis on construction of meaning rather than a set of prescriptive rules. It's not the makeup, but the face underneath, right? That kind of thing. Construction of meaning, echoes into the distance. Man, I see so many students worried about meeting the page count or getting the minimum number of words. Like, good God, if that's all you're writing for, then don't write. There's no point in it, you know? So the point in saying this is too much of an emphasis on grammatical and mechanical correctness is damaging to the relationship a writer has with their process. A relationship with your process. If you're not cultivating that and working to better it and figure out what's wrong with it in order to get that wrong out of the way and make room for more right, then it's either at a standstill, you're using the same method over and over and over for every kind of writing situation that you encounter. Probably the 5-paragraph essay format for any assignment that comes your way. That right there is a red flag indicator that something's wrong with your process. If you're always 5-paragraph essaying it, nah. Check your process, okay? When overemphasized and given all instructive attention, grammatical and mechanical correctness can become restrictive, inhibitory, and corruptive and corrosive because of the distraction it tends to cause away from writing process development and practice. Now look, this is not to say that you should not care about grammar and mechanics. We are not going to counter one extreme with another. You most definitely should care about grammar and mechanics for a number of very important reasons. But do understand that there is a balance you need to achieve between the attention you give correctness and the attention you give your process. If you're developing one and ignoring the other, it's going to collapse just as much as it would if the scales were reversed. All right, so let's get to the scale. So the first stage. Actually, before we get into the first stage, let's just review the intro to the scale itself. So she says, as teachers understand more about writing, they themselves are transformed. Shaughnessy describes a developmental scale for writing teachers, similar to the scales on which students are often measured. According to Shaughnessy, educators must go through stages of unlearning biases and opening themselves up to new ideas. Unlearning biases and opening themselves up to new ideas. Similarly, my understanding of writing and the way I approach it has changed drastically over time. Based on my own experiences as well as what research says about student writers, I created a developmental scale that can be generally applied to most writers' change over time. So look at that again. Based on my own experiences, the personal, as well as what research says about student writers, the impersonal, or the informal and the formal. I created a developmental scale that can be generally applied to most writers' change over time. Although this scale is largely illustrated with examples from my own life, my experiences are not unique. So she's saying what she's gone through is representative of a larger, cumulative, even expected experience. The majority of student writers go through something similar over the course of their schooling. Instead of dictating what students should be doing, this scale describes observable patterns that typically emerge among student writers. It does not always have to occur in the order below, and some stages may be skipped, condensed, or combined. The scale, like the writing process itself, is recursive. Ideally, the writer would get into a cycle of repeating the final 2 stages, which are building on former knowledge and always seeking out new understandings that can be applied to both learning and teaching writing. So, just to recap that, her scale is informed both by research and personal experience. So it's it's intending to achieve and also ultimately achieving, as we see, that balance between 2 different kind of spectrums of life. In that way, she is able to establish its credibility by incorporating all that research, while also bolstering the ethos of her article, bringing in that scholarship, so it shows that she's done the work, she's read the stuff, and she knows what she's talking about. Again, based on my own experiences, as well as what research says about student writers, I created a developmental scale that can be generally applied to most writers' change over time. So it's not absolute, it's not definite, it's not meant to be 100% specific, it's general. it's adaptable to a variety of more specific situations. Instead of dictating what students should be doing, this scale describes observable patterns that typically emerge among student writers. The scale, like the writing process itself, is recursive. Ideally, the writer would get into a cycle of repeating the final 2 stages, building understanding and applying new ideas. So just think about this for a moment. You've got the first 2 stages, which are myths and misconceptions and cognitive dissonance. And then you've got the final 2 stages, which are building understanding and applying new ideas. If you look at those 4 stages as divided or halved in the middle, you can think of myths and misconception and cognitive dissonance as sort of self-enforcing and recurring with each other. If you get stuck in that cycle of recursion with leaning on little evidence-based understanding of the writing process and unfounded and often untrue assumptions about composition, at worst, and then maybe at best, but still on the negative side of it, where you're suspecting something's wrong, but you don't reach that escape velocity to get out of your cognitive dissonance and become able to articulate the problem. That's still the trap. You're still in the trap phase with that. So you want to get out of those first 2 stages and get into a cycle of the 3rd and the 4th stage where they're flowing back into each other and always strengthening and recurring that way and generating your developmental process forward rather than either at a standstill or deteriorating it. So ideally, the writer would get into a cycle of repeating, building understanding, and then applying that new understanding through practice. Yeah, so keep in mind that these stages, building understanding and applying new ideas, don't have to be completely separate or that they cannot coincide. She says in the abstract, some of the stages can combine. It's not necessarily that they exist along a linear path. Oftentimes you will find that you are building your understanding of something while you're applying it or practicing it. That's probably more true than the building understanding coming before the application of it. So another way of saying that is concepts like these abstract, immaterial formations or ideas are not necessarily, which is to say not always, precedents to their manifestations. The idea doesn't always have to exist before the thing itself. You might get an idea from an existing thing. But anyway, sometimes the concept forms while it is in the process of its manifestation. So you might have a new idea about writing while you're writing something. Hey, right? Manifestation, think about it, that's sort of a complex word, but it's really just coming into being or being made or being put into practice, really. This helps explain the common experience of access by way of application. So to read something, to study it, is to get to know it and know it at a deeper level, right? Such as when you finally get Hamlet while writing about it. Maybe reading it didn't do it for your understanding, but you started to put pen to paper and channel that language use toward the goal of increasing your understanding of Hamlet. And what do you know? You start to get Hamlet. It starts to make sense because something's happening during the writing process that's shedding light on what was not able to be seen before. You tried to understand it before, but it just wasn't coming together for you until you put pen to paper and started thinking about it through a different channel. That channel, of course, is writing. Experiences like that feel like moments of discovery, and they can be really enlightening and draw interest toward writing more and more and channeling more and more through writing, especially since writing has proven itself to be a kind of vehicle that moves toward knowing, or at least toward knowing in ways that were keeping Hamlet or whatever it is sealed off prior to or before. David Foster Wallace wouldn't like me saying prior to. You might think of this experience as a writer's high, kind of like a runner's high. When you start to be able to use writing to make sense and to obtain and acquire knowledge, whoa, okay, things are really changing for the better. This is what happened to me, and this is why I attached myself to it. I saw real fruit being produced by, these efforts of cultivation that I was putting forth. And here I am teaching it, and still, loving it more and more every day. Every time I discover something by writing about whatever, myself, something else, a topic I'm interested in or want to inquire into, that feeling of discovery doesn't really go away. It's just as new every time, sometimes even stronger as you move forward. And I love it, and I think it's super valuable, and I hope you do too. So at this point you might be thinking, that's great and all, but I'm not writing about something someone else wrote. I'm writing about myself and my own experiences and memories. This is true if you're writing a literacy narrative right now, which you probably are if you're in my class. To which I might respond, yeah, true, you're not writing an essay about a novel or a play, but let me ask you this. What if you let a memory, your memory, stand in for something someone else wrote? Kind of tweak the variables of the equation. Do that and the concept still works, even if you are applying it in a different way. Rather than making Hamlet accessible and no longer sealed off, now you can get to deeper, more expansive levels of understanding your own memory. Whoa, right? Pretty cool. To which I hope you would say, yes, very cool. All right, so let's back it up a bit and take a tour through the writerly development scale's 4 stages. All right, so here we are at the first stage in the writerly development scale, and it's called Myths and Misconceptions. So essentially, it's defined, or we can observe this as happening by when students affirm that there's a right way or a wrong way to write. And this affirmation it comes about by patchy and erroneous prescriptivist instruction, as Hannah puts it. To see writing in such absolute terms as either right or definitely wrong because it's not this other way, that's way too binary for our level of composition. It's way too either or. It doesn't really leave any room for the middle ground and the grays in between. What we're trying to do in this course is find more fulfilling experiences through writing. I'm going to try and lead you guys down a more correct, hopefully not patchy, not erroneous, and not prescriptivist path. So because of instruction that follows a line with that patchiness and the erroneousness and the prescriptivistness, many students come to believe that grammar is a set of rules and that there is a right way and a wrong way to write. And they define what writing is through the lenses of grammar and mechanics. So, okay, yes, writing involves grammar and it involves mechanics, but writing is not only grammar and it is not only mechanics. It's important. We have to remember grammar and mechanics because these are placeholder methods that are established in a kind of universal manner. Continuing the definition of myths and misconceptions, Hannah says these students' revision process, if they have one at all, consists of catching formal errors. They have no knowledge of the way in which people learn to write and most likely think that the world is divided up between those who can write and those who cannot. It's like you either got it or you don't got it at all. That's nonsense. You can acquire it. You can practice it and get better at it and obtain it to higher and higher levels of capability. But it's not a case of, I just can't write. I didn't do good on this paper because I just can't write. You can get better at writing, and it might take a while and, be challenging, but it's not because if you made a bad grade on a paper in the past, it's not because you just don't have the stuff. And notice again, like that kind of thinking, that division between people who either got it or don't got it, that's That's an either-or way of measuring capacity, isn't it? I either have it or I don't. I'm just not one of those people that can write, but like there are people that can write. I'm just not one of those. There's a clear line of division if you're defining yourself as someone who just can't write. You got to get past that. You got to get past that if that's you. But whether it's not having any knowledge of knowing how to write or what a writing process is, whether it's being constricted by a binary perspective about writing, whether it's, defining yourself even further apart from being able to write by seeing writers as solitary, confined, and tortured geniuses spitting out novels and fits of inspiration. All of that leads to this final conclusion, final defining conclusion of what the myths and misconceptions phase really encapsulates. It's the mindset of not enjoying writing or even thinking of themselves as writers because their perception of what writing is and what the writing process looks like has been so skewed. So she continues talking about what the myths and misconceptions phase is for the next few paragraphs, for the rest of the section given to it. But she does this in an interesting way, and it has to do with how she's structuring and shifting between the formal and the informal. Structuring and sequencing and blending between, which is really all just to say hybridizing the academic and the personal, or the formal and the informal. Or you might even think of it as research with experience, or report of other information with narration of one's own lived information. So, as we already discussed, she first defines the stage by referentially supporting it with definition, work and insights from other scholars, and using that as the academic and formal and research-based grounds to then bring in her own story and set that in relation to this more formal base. So by bringing in her own personal experiences, especially with the use of pronouns like my and I, she's using her own character to, further define or really extend the definition that she set in motion by beginning with the formal academic and research foundation and approach. But not only is the section hybridized like this, even the sentences have the same hybridization within them. Here's an example of that. She says, I was taught grammar and therefore writing because at that time I was told that writing and grammar were inseparable in a way that overemphasized and overassessed mechanical correctness. And here it is, as described by Connors. She's reading this article by Connors and then seeing that as able to resonate with her own experiences. So what does she do? She identifies what those experiences are, puts them on paper, sequences them in a way that leads back to where the idea came from. So you can imagine it as, this is not necessarily how things unfolded in the course of her composing this, but I think it's effective as an illustration. And I'm imagining it or presuming it to have been prompted by her reading Connors as part of this research project. I think it's a cool idea to be studying an article, to let that trigger a personal experience, but to be able to recognize what's going on and grab hold of that experience before it just drifts away, put it down, and then try and trace it back to where it was prompted from. I guess in this case from her reading Connors or whatever it might be. In that way, it's a hybridization, but it's also a bringing full circle, right? Throughout the piece, she has more of these hybridizations at the sentence level, and I suppose what I'll do here is send you on a sort of treasure hunt to look for those and record those as representative points of this idea of hybridizing between the formal and the informal, so that you can become more familiar with those. Each time you find a new example, the idea of hybridizing the formal and the informal, or the personal with the impersonal, or like your own story with some researched element, it recurs, right? And recursion starts to reify into this repeatable experience. You do that enough and you can start to take hold of it, and it becomes a tool in your writer's toolbox. All right, so moving on to the next stage, cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance in the realm of psychology is the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitude change. In this phase, in the cognitive dissonance phase, the writer begins to suspect that something is wrong with the way they have been taught writing, but has no knowledge about language to back up their hunch. They can sense that there is a problem, but cannot articulate what the problem is. So they're like, I think just something's wrong. Something doesn't feel right. I'm unsettled, but I don't know why. I need to define it. I need to articulate what that problem is. This stage is interesting because the possibility of escaping the myths and misconceptions phase and getting into the recursion of those final two healthier stages, that possibility is increasing, right? But it's not guaranteed. It's not a probability yet. It's just a possibility, even though the odds are starting to acquire more potential energy, right, to be activated, hopefully. So yeah, in this phase, the writer begins to suspect that something is wrong with the way they have been taught writing, but has no knowledge about language to back up their hunch. They can sense that there is a problem, but cannot articulate what the problem is. They are frustrated because they lack the resources to find a better way, or maybe they haven't been given the resources or any kind of awareness to find them. And so continue on as they always have, only now with the creeping dissatisfaction at the back of their mind. Like you're coming to the end of a movie and you're hoping for the resolution to occur, but it just never happens. There's no resolution, and it's very dissatisfying. That's frustrating, right? Inarticulation yields frustration, which in turn yields no change. And no change is the same thing as saying a return to restriction. It's not being able to achieve enough escape velocity and get out of that cycle of recursion and on to the next stage. Yeah. Watching TED Talks, as I am very prone to do, especially in the mornings over coffee, they're a great way to start the day, I'll tell you that. I found an example of what this looks like in a TED Talk given by Adam Driver. You may recognize this guy here if you've seen any of the recent Star Wars movies. He plays Kylo Ren. I'll let you watch this on your own, but essentially he's just communicating in a different manner this idea of inarticulation yielding frustration, but finally achieving articulation allows you to breathe and get closer to that resolution for real, instead of it just fading away as this unfulfilled possibility. But describing something for the first time that before was indescribable, he felt positive change occurring for himself as he was able to put words into feelings for the first time. Feelings inarticulated can be unsatisfying, or to do that, to put thoughts into words or put feelings into words and to make that transaction really occur, you start to realize, wow, like this is a really valuable tool. Hannah says, contradiction was everywhere. Yeah, if you're trying to articulate something, the last thing you want to do is keep encountering contradiction after contradiction, right? And I can only imagine that this string of continued encounters with contradiction reinforced the likelihood of falling back into this state of cognitive dissonance. She says, it was upsetting because I felt that I disagreed with how I had been taught and how states and schools teach writing, but I had no idea why I felt that way. She's looking for an idea. And beyond the idea, to start to understand why it's making her feel the way she does. And finally she says, I could not provide any evidence. It was just a feeling, but an irksome one that would not leave me alone. You can imagine it might have left her alone if she was able to put it into words and to understand it, or to put it to apply an idea to it, right? And that leads us into the next stage, the third stage, building understanding. Opening her definition here, she says, that feeling, the irksome one from the cognitive dissonance stage that wouldn't leave her alone, that feeling propelled her into the next stage, building understanding, in which the writer's perspective on writing shifts as they finally find alternatives to the way they have been taught. They begin to unlearn the harmful and incorrect things they have been told about language and writing. They start to view the rules they grew up with as a set of tools, not absolutes, and see how they can be applied in different situations to improve the complexity and appropriateness of their writing. They understand that grammar and editing are not writing, and that different texts use different formats and language. They gain knowledge of the writing process and the way people learn to write. It's almost like she's describing a kind of enlightenment, except for writing, Building understanding is largely a process of unlearning damaging ideas, of making corrections and filling in gaps, and seeing clearly for the first time what was always just blurry blankness. So rules become tools. Instead of absolutes, they become just things you can use to get the job done. I have come to see writing as a way of discovering and creating meaning. Whoa, that's a sea change. That is a total perspective shift, right? A metamorphosis has truly occurred if she went from seeing writing as this unattainable thing that, was forever away from her, to this thing that she can build toward and use purposely and intentionally beyond the prescriptivist bounds given to her as the absolutes before. We can do things like discover and create and make meaning through both of those, and even more, And this is why writing is generative, why it allows for invention to occur. You can invent through writing. Invention takes place. In short, writing is not sitting alone for a few hours, plucking out some words, proofreading, and calling it good. It's a vibrant, many-tiered process that involves much more than just one person trying to transcribe their thoughts on paper. Yeah, I love that sentence, because not only is it a call-out, it's a correction, right? It's like this statement of revelation. In short, I've realized that writing, it's not sitting alone for a few hours, just plucking out some words and then proofreading and calling it good enough to submit or whatever. No. It's much more than that. It's vibrant. It's many-tiered. There's all these processes, and they're overlapping and stacking and morphing and just moving together in very interesting ways that we can manage and maintain and discover and use to create. That process, it involves much more than just me, than just one person trying to transcribe my thoughts on paper. No, writing is collaborative. It happens across contexts. It happens between people. And it doesn't have to be just paper. It doesn't have to be just thoughts. It can be feelings. It can be other modes and means of recording expression and thinking and research, etc. It's limitless. And finally, we reach the fourth stage, applying new ideas. Here, the writer starts to put the things they have learned to use in their own writing. It's not just the revelation and the realization anymore, it's the practice and that real development. They're developing their own writing process. You're taking charge, you're building autonomy. You're getting a handle on something that was elusive and unobtainable to you before. But now it's yours. You're owning it and you're possessing it. It's like one of those little wheels that you've memorized that you're becoming more and more familiar with, maybe to the point of mastery. You know techniques. You can start to view other people's writing through a new lens, through writing published by scholars, through writing given to you by peers, your friends, your family, whoever, emails, wherever it's happening. Language is being used all around us all the time, and in one way or another, it's crafted. Making this chain of the third and fourth stage of building, understanding, and applying new ideas, making that a chain of recursion, a habit, right? That's the ultimate goal. Because once you habitualize reaching for new ways and putting them into practice and trying to build knowledge and build that even more and increase it through application and start to see composition as just everything that's happening around us all the time, this constant structuration of culture and society and language and everything else, arts, it just keeps extending outward and outward. And that's cool. It's mysterious. And where there's mystery, there's... So, before I get too kind of a love letter to writing for y'all, let me just drive this final point home by kind of partial quote on the slide here. The original quote is, "Once I was able to let go of the need to always write perfectly, I was able to be much more productive and create a more useful first draft with lots of content I can pull from and rearrange." But I like stopping it at B because I think that captures like the larger notion at work here. Once I was able to let go of the need to always write perfectly, I was able to just be. There weren't so many worries pinning her down and restricting her from the movement that she felt called to, Just a really nice way of thinking about it. So finally, we'll talk about the last section in the article, and that is implications for teaching. So this really speaks to me, but I want y'all to hear this too. Implications for teaching. So applying new ideas creates space for strategizing how to forward those ideas to others. That's what I'm doing here, trying to apply new ideas, build my understanding of them first, of course, by researching and reading and doing that constantly and broadly in various capacities. Even though I'm the teacher and this is implications for teaching, it also speaks to y'all because we're going to do peer-to-peer collaboration. And even if we're not doing that directly, like in live groups, face-to-face in class, you can still think of this as a way to help each other out, to forward an idea to one of your classmates about how they might improve their writing, or even just to start a conversation. Create productive conversation with your classmates about writing. Just PM somebody and be like, hey, I was thinking about this article and this is what I think. I was wondering if you had any thoughts and maybe we could, exchange sentiments or something. I don't know. Talking about writing is very important, though. I don't want to be the only one talking to y'all, and I don't want teachers being the only people talking to y'all about writing. That separates it from a more real reality, you know what I mean? So, I got to ask you this. You can email me about this or let me know however, but really think about this for a second. Have your English or writing teachers, have they ever shared with you something that they wrote? Have they ever let you look at their writing process? Usually when I ask this question, if there's a class of 25 students, maybe a couple, 3 at most, will raise their hands and say, yeah, my English teacher showed me something they wrote. But the vast majority consistently don't raise their hands. So believe me, I will be sharing some writing with y'all, and I'm going to let you look at my process. So in this same section, she also talks about the importance of something called mentor texts. This idea, this concept, is something that we'll get into in a lot greater detail soon enough, reading a couple of articles about it specifically. But, you can see this article by Hannah as a kind of mentor text because it's establishing this way for you to measure where you are, to locate yourself along a sequence of definable stages. And finally, I guess the take-home message even though there's a lot more to take home than this, the emphasis in writing classrooms should always be on the process. Not on the product, not on the superficial, not on the prescriptivist, not on the rules. On the process, on the development, on the change over time, on what's really going on when you write.